Thanks. So I hadn't thought of myself as someone who studies embodied intelligence and didn't really entirely understand what it is, but I think now I do. And I guess I was thinking just shortly before this talk that if embodied intelligence is, in short, the interaction between the nervous system and the morphology and the environment, then massive environmental changes such as during mass extinctions, should be extremely important for embodied intelligence and therefore nervous systems and morphology and their interactions. So that's kind of what this talk is about today, is about my research that's ongoing on the evolution of locomotion across a major evolutionary transition. And I'll be explaining that in a moment. If I can get my slides to advance. Yes. I want to thank my big team that's helped me out over the years with this research. We had ERC funding for a while for this Dawn Dinos project, which has a website. You can check it out if you want to know more about the research, but that grant has ended, but the research is still continuing very much apace. So my research is more broadly about how organisms work and how the way they work evolves. We can think about that in this kind of classic behavior context of Tinbergen's compass, where we think about the nexus of function, how things work and how things evolve. In my research, I'm very interested in major locomotor specializations, including how change of size from large to small or small to large influences locomotion, how its body size is a locomotor specialization, how that evolves or how it changes during ontogeny. So there are temporal aspects to my research. I study ontogeny, as well as phylogeny, evolutionary timescales, as well as ahistorical context like functional morphology, just basically how things work, and adaptation, how things are suited to their environment. And I do this through a wide range of methodologies, from empirical to theoretical. They're all listed there, and you'll see a great deal of them throughout this talk. So I'm going to talk about an idea that is out there as a hypothesis for the success of dinosaurs. Then I'll talk about how some of their living relatives walk through some experimental data. And then I'll go through simulations, which will be a large component of this talk, will be about how we can use biomechanical simulations to understand the movements of living and extinct animals in jumping, walking, and running. And then I'll summarize things and give kind of a progress report on this research. But as a spoiler, I'm going to tell you that there's still a long way to go, and we don't have an answer to this, the first point on the locomotor superiority hypothesis, which I'll now move on to explain. But if you're interested in this topic, we did a nice initial synthesis paper in the integrative and comparative biology, 3 years ago. Okay, so back only about 250 million years ago, there was a major change in flora and fauna and so forth on Earth. And this was during the Triassic period. So there was a huge mass extinction at the end of the Permian period, 250-ish million years ago, in which almost all life got wiped out on Earth. But then the survivors went on and diversified through the Triassic period, which is what I'm going to talk about here. Initially, the Triassic period went on until 201 million years ago, when there was another mass extinction at the end of the Triassic-Jurassic boundary or mass extinction, which is where there was a transition in terms of organisms that we see before and after. So during the Triassic, there was the rise of new groups that weren't really dominant anywhere on Earth until that time period. And one of the groups, which is what I'll be talking about today, is the group whose formal name is the archosaurs. So there's two groups within the archosaurs. There's the crocodile lineage here in green on the left, and the bird or dinosaur lineage here in red on the right. So this is the tree of life of those organisms, the phylogeny of living and extinct archosaurs. Birds and crocodiles are, by definition, living archosaurs, whereas a lot of other things that are archosaurs are extinct. Indeed, yes, there were these mass extinctions in the late Triassic. There were floodings, there were volcanisms, and so forth, leading up to the very end of the Triassic. There were massive eruptions causing global warming, sea level rises, patches of extreme humidity and aridity. All of this might seem somewhat familiar given the current climate crisis, but it was much slower. Nonetheless, it wiped out a huge fraction of life on Earth. So that's rather sobering. There was a lineage that was quite common during the Triassic period. This lineage in green here, the crocodile lineage, which is called the Pseudosuchia, they were really diverse, lots of interesting forms, but they got completely wiped out except for the final branch that led to crocodiles. That survived for reasons we don't understand. Whereas the red branch here, the dinosaur branch, did pretty darn well, along with flying reptiles called pterosaurs. So they survived the mass extinction. And for many years, people have wondered why. Why did dinosaurs do well, whereas the crocodile lineage, the Pseudosuchia, did very poorly and got almost completely wiped out? Well, one idea is the locomotor superiority hypothesis, namely that well, there's been a variety of incarnations of this, but basically the idea is that dinosaurs had different locomotor morphology, which led to different abilities to locomote. And there's one example from estimating speed from footprints shown on this graph here, suggesting that for a given kind of hip height versus foot length ratio, the Pseudosuchians, the crocodile line animals, versus the ornithodyrans, the dinosaur line animals, remember the ones in red, for a given hip height, the dinosaur line animals were longer legged and therefore faster. And perhaps because they were also bipedal and digitigrade, meaning they stood up on their tiptoes rather than flat-footed, maybe that made them better able to run quickly, move more efficiently, and ultimately perhaps survive the mass extinction at the end of the Triassic. But these ideas didn't really catch on very well in the whole debate about the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. Mostly people thought, oh, dinosaurs got lucky. It wasn't anything special about them. They were just in the right place at the right time. But it's beginning to come back, the idea that maybe dinosaurs did have something unusual about them that we can invoke to help explain why they were so successful, especially after the Triassic. Nonetheless, the links between morphology and function and performance, like speed, are really not well demonstrated. And that's where I came in. I wanted to know, can we do better than pretty simple metrics of performance, linking that back to function and morphology? So I proposed in a grant to do a bunch of experiments and models and simulations to really quantify form and function performance across a variety of behaviors in living and extinct archosaurs, so in crocodiles and in little birds I'll show you in a moment, called tinamous, as well as a selection of diversity of extinct archosaurs. And there is a whole protocol explaining how we built these models. I spent my whole career, the last 25 years, developing methods to go from bones all the way up to 3D computer anatomically realistic models. There's no way I can explain all of that to you in today's talk, but if you want to know more, ask me or see this paper, which explains all the details more or less. So we can measure how living archosaurs move, and we can do that very, very, very precisely using an advanced technology called XROM, or X-ray reconstruction of moving morphology. We can take multiple planar fluoroscopy or X-ray views of an organism walking through two different fluoroscopes, and then fit an articulated digital skeleton to that, like a marionette, basically, in animation software like Autodesk Maya, a very popular animation package, and then very precisely be able to quantify how the joints move in an animal that we had move in an experiment in our lab. So we did that for both for these little birds called tinamous and for, which I just showed, and then for crocodiles as well. So here's kind of the results of those measurements of crocodile walking and tinamous bird walking. The green arrows in these images are the forces on the foot during ground contact. That's called the ground reaction force. And then the bottom panels show the changes in joint angles, which I don't expect you to read through them all, but basically what they show is that crocodiles show a lot of complicated 3D motions, especially around the hip. Their hip is very 3D in its motions, whereas in birds, the hip doesn't move very much. Instead, the toes, the metatarsophalangeal angle, this light blue angle here, moves quite a lot, as well as the knee in particular and the ankle to a somewhat lesser degree. So tinamous use their lower limbs to move a lot, whereas crocodiles use their upper limbs to move more. That's something that's been well established before, and we added more data to help understand that, as well as information on the forces that they apply on their environment in order to move. So to summarize very briefly, omitting a lot of detail of how living archosaurs walk, birds exert vertical forces on their limbs that are 2 times greater than those of crocodiles, and that's kind of not surprising at all because they're bipedal, so they have to exert more force on each of their hind limbs, whereas crocodiles have their forelimbs to support themselves as well. Because crocodiles are more sprawling than birds, birds are quite erect. Crocodiles hold their legs further away from their body, although they're still somewhat erect. Crocodiles have more lateralized forces, so they're pushing somewhat more away from their body with their limbs. And I already mentioned how the hip moves more in crocodiles. It's also held more abducted or sprawling, whereas birds have more knee, ankle, and toe rotations in a plane rather than in a more three-dimensional world than in crocodiles. So that's a very brief introduction to the mechanics of walking. Now, we played back those mechanics through computer models, which I already showed you in the previous slide. I go back here. So these are actually animations from a computer model that incorporates the experimental data and then solves the very difficult problem of muscle redundancy in terms of how are the muscles activated and how much force do they exert and how much do they lengthen or shorten across a whole stride of an animal moving. That's a tremendously difficult problem, but a computer can solve that, whereas we never could as human beings on paper. So we've done this. We played back the experimental data through the computer and have the computer solve, given these motions and these forces, how did the crocodile walk? How did the bird walk? And we get very reassuring results that our experimental data match independent experimental data that aren't included in the simulation, match the inverse simulation outputs fairly well. So inverse simulation means you run the simulation with experimental data rather than having the simulation tell you what happens. You tell it what happens. And what the simulation reveals is very comfortingly that there are key muscles active during ground contact that very well fit electromyographic EMG recordings in vivo. I won't go through all the muscles and names and so forth, but there's a big muscle running from the tail to the thigh, for example, in crocodiles that's very important in locomotion. And they have other muscles that we have, like a gastrocnemius and digital flexors and adductors and so forth that they use. But it's mainly the hip and their thigh muscle mass that's active in supporting them, and they use some of their more high leverage anti-gravity muscles to move. Now, I want to move on for the rest of this talk really to looking at simulations of archosaur performance that get away mostly from inverse simulation, because that's always very constrained by relying on experimental data, and you can't actually really ask questions about, well, what would happen if the animal had this morphology or this kind of task. You're just bound by what data you have for the experiment. There are wonderful methods to predictively simulate movement, including performance. For example, solving optimal control problems. To do that, we need a model like we see animated here, where there's skeletal anatomy with joint locations and ranges of motion. There's the muscular anatomy, the red and the blue lines shown there. Blue is less active in this simulation, red is more active. So we need the paths and the leverages of those muscles. We need the physiology, how much force the muscles can exert, how quickly they can contract, the body segment dimensions, masses, centers of mass and inertia, other information like how passively stiff are the joints. And then we need to give the simulations tasks and constraints. Here's what it needs to do optimally, and here's what it can't do what kinds of bounds there are on the possibilities of output simulation results. So first, I'm going to show you jumping simulations because this is a very strenuous behavior. We know that very well. There's been a lot of studies of jumping in animals experimentally, as well as some simulation work, and we understand human jumping pretty well too. It involves rapid production of forces, large ranges of joint motion, much more so than normal walking or running. So it's very demanding on the musculoskeletal system. It tends to involve adaptations like long legs and great muscle masses, and others that may be more specific to certain groups like catapult mechanisms and so forth. But experimental study of maximal performance can be rather hard in jumping as well as in other kinds of behaviors. And these are unsteady explosive behaviors, so not hopping like in kangaroos. I'm talking about kind of one-shot ballistic behaviors. So to solve a jumping simulation using optimal control as the problem, we need to maximize some physiologically relevant performance criterion, like in jumping, get as high vertically, which I'll focus on here today, or as far horizontally in a single movement. And previous simulation approaches along these lines had almost exclusively looked at human jumping, and application to other species is still just getting off the ground, so to speak. We did simulations of tinamous, our wonderful South American birds, mostly from Patagonia and Argentina. There's quite a few dozen species. The one we looked at is the elegant crested tinamu, Eudromia elegans, kind of smallish, partridge-like little bird, prefers to run rather than fly. It's very interestingly more closely related to the rat-type birds, the ostriches and emus and rheas and so forth. It's not closely related to the birds it looks like partridges and quails and so forth. It's kind of a weird evolutionary side branch. So we built a musculoskeletal model of our tinamu, one of our subjects that we used experimentally in OpenSim software, which is the software we tend to use for musculoskeletal modeling and simulation. It's fully three-dimensional. Each limb has 6 main degrees of freedom, so 6 rotational motions the limb is able to do, mostly at the hip. And then there's 2 legs, and the pelvis can move, so it's a total of 18 degrees of freedom. There's 36 muscles in each leg. There's a certain kind of biomechanical model of muscle called the hill-type model, very, very popular one, with limitations, but still widely used, that we used in our simulations. And the input parameters were all from dissection and even some data from in vivo recordings and in vitro and so forth. So we had a very good model of the real animal. And we asked that model to then try to solve the optimal control problem of jumping as high as it could and then landing in its starting position again. So we had hard constraints like left and right limbs had to be perfectly symmetrical, and so on and so forth. I won't go through all the details, but if you're really interested in these kinds of methods, it's trajectory optimization is the class that we of solvers that we used, specifically direct collocation, using OpenSim's MATLAB API, which has a part of it called the muscle redundancy solver, and then Casati to solve the algorithmic differentiation. At the time when we did this work, it took only 29 minutes to solve. We didn't need a supercomputer, even though it is a very complicated problem. And these days, it's more like a matter of a few minutes we could run it in. And we don't even need to give it an initial guess on movement, on the posture at the start of the jump. It just takes a cold start, just picks a semi-random posture and then filters down from those to an optimal jumping pattern. And so here's what we got for our jumping tinamu. It jumped like that. So that's the takeoff and landing forces, as well as muscle activations and so forth in front view and in side view. I'll just let that play a bit. The model more than doubled its center of mass height, so it did pretty well. The peak vertical force was 2.6 times body weight, which is lower than we would see experimentally in other birds like guinea fowl and turkeys. But tinamous are kind of skinny compared to those birds, so maybe it is realistic that they can produce less force than guinea fowl and turkeys. Unfortunately, we could not do an inverse simulation of our tinamou jumping because they would not jump for us in the lab. They'd walk and they'd run, but jumping was just not something they were interested in doing. They're kind of flighty birds, a bit nervous, and it's hard to motivate them sometimes. So in a way, predictive simulations helped us get around that problem. Other aspects of their movements are pretty similar to what we know of for other birds in particular. And they do a counter movement. So if you watch that simulation, it bends its legs before it takes off the ground. So it goes down and then up before it leaves the ground, and it extends its legs as it's leaving the ground. And you might think, oh, is it doing that to store energy in its tendons like springs or something like that? But no, we got rid of all the muscles and just had the joints actuated by torque motors. So no muscle at all, just driving with rotational forces, and the same thing happens. So basically that tells us that it's the physics of jumping that causes a counter movement, not the muscle physiology or mechanics or anything like that. About 75% of the muscles were maximally recruited during takeoff, and that especially was the case for like the gastrocnemius muscles, the ankle extensors, much like in us, they're very important. Huge muscles in birds, and they increase their force during liftoff. So if you follow this graph, there is the red portion is during liftoff. The muscles are lengthening on the x-axis and increasing force on the y-axis, and then that goes down as they're taking off, and then comes around as the muscles shorten back toward their resting length, and decrease their excitation, and so forth. So those major ankle extensors are very, very important, and recruited while they are lengthening is an important aspect. So that allows them to generate a lot of force passively as well as actively. We've done some sensitivity analyses on input parameters that could influence jump performance, because there's a lot unknown that goes into these simulations. So muscle strength, muscle contraction velocity, tendon stiffness, how long the model has to lift off and land across the whole limb and individual joints. We looked at these various parameters and found that a lot of things were very, very similar. Jump height was most affected by how much force the muscles could produce, relatively speaking, and to a lesser degree, how quickly they could contract. But the key difference was that any change we made to the ankle had the greatest influence. So if we increased the force the muscles around the ankle could generate alone, the model could jump a lot higher relative to changing anything else. Tendon stiffness and how long the model had to jump really didn't do a lot as a constraint. So this is a nice simulation of jumping using optimal control. It captured a lot of aspects of real jumping and showed that yeah, these evolved from just the basic physics. And it's encouraging. So we can perhaps use this in looking at fossil species. So what the heck, we're a bit bold. We went ahead and did that. Did some simulations of jumping in extinct archosaurs, including a dinosaur cousin that's very small called Logosuchus, a really big dinosaur that's over 1,000 kilograms called Musaurus, a very moderately small-sized early carnivorous dinosaur called Coelophysis, and then our tinamou, again, using the same inputs for the tinamou simulation as we did before, but customizing our models and simulations for the extinct animals to suit their morphology and other details. This is just very preliminary work. We're still refining this work a lot, but it's very clear that the tail is used a lot in jumping in these animals, and that makes a lot of sense. Jumping, in order to be effective, needs to use a lot of work, so a lot of force production and a lot of displacement of the center of mass vertically. If you displace your tail vertically, that is the center of mass of your tail, you therefore help displace your center of mass of your body vertically, and you get a bigger jump if you therefore move your tail more vertically during the jump. Birds don't have a big tail. They can't do that. So instead, birds seem to use pitch of their bodies. So comparing our medium-sized Triassic dinosaur to our tinamou, we find that they use pretty similar limb movements overall, except the extinct dinosaur uses more ankle motion. Birds keep their ankle pretty stable during jumping, and they can jump to similar relative heights in these simulations, which is rather interesting. This is what those simulations look like again. Very importantly, the tail is 23% of body mass in that coelophysis model, whereas it's basically almost 0% in the tinamou. And so increasing dorsiflexion of that tail, like I said, increases jumping height. So how much range of motion the tail had in the simulations gives greater jumping height if it's a greater range of motion. We showed that very clearly with sensitivity analyses. Whereas changing other things like how much torque the tail could generate around its base or other things had less influence on the outputs. Whereas the tinamou pitched a lot, pitched its body up and down instead of using any sort of tail. The dinosaur didn't do that so much. It used its tail instead. So there's kind of a dichotomy here between early dinosaurs with big tails and their descendants, birds, with very, very short tails that use body pitch to jump instead. So given that there's an evolutionary trend as we go through dinosaurs closer and closer and closer to the ancestry of birds, the tail gets shorter and shorter and shorter. The center of mass moves forward along the body toward the head. We would predict that dinosaurs and early birds with shorter tails would have jumped by using more body pitch and less tail motion. So there's a transition from using tail dorsiflexion to using body pitch to aid in jumping. Okay, so then we've looked at tinamou walking and running using, again, optimal control problems solved with direct collocation, same basic approach. And what we did here, which is different from the jumping simulations, is we preset a target speed for the simulation as a goal for the simulation, and it solved for the forward displacement of the center of mass in one stride that matched that target speed. So if we set the target speed as slow, we should get walking. If we set it as fast, it should get running. And we have experimental data, so we could compare those predictions of the model or the simulation to the actual experimental data of real birds to see how well they matched. And we found that they matched pretty darn well. So a walking tinamou in a simulation walks pretty similarly overall to a real tinamou. The ground reaction forces in the red curve here in the upper right are pretty similar overall, qualitatively and quantitatively. Other parameters like how long the feet are on the ground, how long the stride is, are quite similar overall. So that's encouraging. We could get walking done pretty well. And it didn't have to be. It could have been really different because this is a predictive simulation. It's not constrained by any experimental data at all. It's just compared to them independently. Now with running, we get pretty good matches as well. I'll caution that this dark red line here is for extrapolations from all data from a wide variety of avian species, whereas these other two lines are for the simulation and, if I remember correctly, the simulation and the actual bird data. So again, running simulations and experiments match pretty well. So again, that's quite reassuring that we can simulate walking and running and jumping in tinamous pretty well, we think. And here we have nice EMG data, so muscle activity data in vivo for tinamous as well as other bird locomotion. I'm not going to go through all these graphs. The number of graphs here is just to show you that we've measured a lot of different muscles. And the gray period here, the y-axis is excitation of the muscle. So from 0 to 1, 0 to 100% excitation of the muscle. The x-axis is time. The grayed out area is when the foot is on the ground. So some muscles are like this IC on the far left are active more when the foot is off the ground in the white area of the graph, whereas others are more active when the foot is on the ground, like this third muscle, the ILPO, A, and P. That's a more stance phase muscle, as we call it, so used during ground contact. By and large, these simulations match pretty well, but as we would think, you're never going to get a perfect match, and there were some weird patterns that we were unable to explain or just were wrong. That's the way it goes. It is only a simulation. We then kept the simulation going up until it could not run any faster, and that speed it ran to was 3.4 meters per second, which we don't know how fast our tinamous are. We never could get them going at anything that seemed like top speed, much like we could never get them to jump. But compared with other birds of their size, they're right in the ballpark of what kind of speed we'd expect for them. Around 3 meters a second for a bird of their size is expected. So that's reassuring, again, that we're able to roughly simulate maximal running speed. Which obviously brings me to the point of, can we then simulate dinosaur locomotion? Well, you already saw an animation here of a dinosaur running, and yeah, that kind of gives away the punchline that we tried to do that. But to get you to that point of understanding of how we did that, here we used an important assumption where we simplified our muscle model, getting rid of the rather complicated hill type model, which needs information on muscle architecture, like how strong the muscles are, how fast they can contract, how long the muscle fibers are, their angle with respect to the tendons, on and so forth. Our simple model had only two factors in it. That is how much force was generated passively on the first graph's y-axis here, versus how long the muscle tendon unit was. So that passive stretch force was input into the model for different muscles. And then how much force was output given a certain amount of stiffness of the muscle tendon unit. So how much stiffness is force per unit for per unit length change, basically. So we see that there's kind of an optimum maximal force for generating, or an optimum stiffness for generating maximal force, more or less. And our best model required the lowest Fmax, the lowest force, to generate 3.4 meters a second, that maximal running speed. So also, we then ran our simulation using a full-on hill model for tinamous, where we do have all the muscle architecture data. So we ran a simple muscle model running simulation for our tinamou, and then the more complicated muscle model running tinamou, and found that they matched pretty well in their outputs. So we covered our bases with that one as well as we could. Okay, so we went back to this early Triassic, or late Triassic, really early carnivorous dinosaur, which was bipedal, short arms, long tail, long neck, claws, teeth, so forth. It was around 13 kilograms, very well known from hundreds of fossils, and pretty representative of the earliest dinosaurs in general for its overall body plan. And because birds are descendants of theropod dinosaurs, it has a body plan that's also transitional between that and the earliest archosaurs, or other reptiles and birds. So it's rather useful. We built a musculoskeletal model, which I've already shown before in the jumping simulations. These are the details for it. It had joints in the neck and the back, pretty simple vertebral column joints overall, but that's just to keep the solvability of the problem more manageable. And we then ran it until it could run no faster, and found that it could run up to almost 7 meters per second. And here it's a bit challenging. So how can we evaluate the validity of a model in a simulation where we have no experimental data at all and really no benchmark to compare it with? Well, at least we have data from birds, so we can compare it with what data it outputs from the simulation versus data from experiments with birds. And we find that it outputs a lot of vertical force during its step. It has rather short contact times of the feet with the ground, which means that because its feet are on the ground for a shorter time, it needs to exert greater force during that time in order to maintain the average force on its body constant across a whole stride. So the limb is basically very, very stiff. It's generating a lot of force very, very quickly, unlike in birds, which have a more compliant limb. But actually, we suspect that these dinosaurs had pretty stiff limbs. If you look at this simulation, the leg is very straight, kind of like in a human running, relatively speaking. And a lot of aspects of their morphology suggest that their limbs were fairly straight, unlike birds, which have rather crouched um, limbs, especially at the hip and at the knee. So we think there's maybe some plausibility, at least, to this, but otherwise, the other reassuring fact is that the foot placements of this model match footprints of similar sized dinosaurs running pretty well. And also muscle activation patterns of muscles simulated in the model match expectations from or recordings from other living archosaurs. So like the big tail muscle running from the tail to the thigh that I showed earlier in crocodiles, that's active during ground contact, during the stance phase, which it should be in order to pull the thigh backwards and push the animal forwards. Same thing with the adductor muscle running from the ischium to the femur here. It acts along with the cauda femoralis to pull the thigh backwards. And then there are these other two muscles, which are kind of like human gluteal muscles. They run from the front of the pelvis down onto the upper part of the femur, and they act biphasically. So they act once during ground contact and once during limb protraction or limb swinging forwards. During ground contact, they are abductors of the hip, so they're supporting the hip in one-legged stance. Whereas during a swing, they're swinging the leg forwards, acting as like I said, protractors. So they're bifunctional muscles, these two things, which are in the model and interesting muscles that exist only in, we think, in the earliest dinosaurs and in living birds. Their homologs in other reptiles are much simpler. Anyway, the results agree pretty well with independent analyses from trackways. Like I said, I also earlier in my career used very simple models of locomotion of these dinosaurs, and our results from our more complicated models agree pretty well with them. One thing we found that we didn't expect, we're looking down on top of the simulation of coelophysis here, is that as the hind limb goes retracting backwards, the tail flexes laterally toward it. And that wasn't something we told it to do. It just solved that problem and clearly was conserving angular momentum. We looked at the momentum of the tail and found that it was indeed doing that. It was timing its swing in order to conserve momentum, which is something that humans also do. We swing our arms to conserve angular momentum. We don't have a tail that we can swing, and their arms in early dinosaurs weren't very big, so they wouldn't do that either. This, again, we found by turning off the muscles, emerges from the passive physics of motion. It's not something about the tail muscles need to pull the tail toward the retracting limb. Instead, it's just ideal for probably stability and efficiency for there to be this swinging of the tail toward the retracting limb. We thought that was pretty cool of a finding, and yeah, it makes a lot of sense to us. So wrapping up, we've done some of the first 3D simulations of walking and running and jumping in non-human species using optimal control simulations, especially able to capture the most fundamental aspects of avian movement and force patterns, the kinematics and the kinetics, even including the maximal running speed and maybe jumping height as well. We adopted this simple muscle model that worked reasonably well for both living birds and extinct theropod dinosaurs, the coelophysis. It has a lot of assumptions. It's not perfect, but does seem to have value. And some of the assumptions it makes are really helpful because we don't know how big the muscles were in these animals. So it gets around that problem somewhat. So these methods are encouraging for applying to other fossil archosaurs. What I've only shown you so far is really focusing on one, the coelophysis, which is a really great choice because it's so perfectly representative of early dinosaurs. But there's much more that we can look at now that we have this set of methods running and actually a lot more data that we can apply to those methods too. What I've shown you in this progress, in this summary of this talk, What I've shown you is that living archosaurs, crocodiles, and birds can help us understand the evolutionary polarity. Basically, crocodiles have some traits that are ancestral or primitive for the whole group, whereas birds gradually evolve their more and more specialized ways of moving. But also, living archosaurs are very, very important in that they help us evaluate how good our models and simulations are at all, especially give us confidence in this case for applying them to extinct archosaurs with caution. These experimental data sort of validate, I don't quite like the word, but it at least help evaluate the inverse and predictive simulations and show us where they go right and where they go wrong. And also the predictive simulations can estimate walk to run gait transitions, jumping and running and so forth, giving qualitatively good estimates through these quantitative approaches. And that's the philosophy I tend to take, is that yes, these simulations give us quite impressive numbers and so forth, but really in the end, because there are so many unknowns, even for living animals, let alone for extinct ones, really what we get out of them mainly is qualitative answers. So one animal might be a bit faster than another or be able to jump a bit higher, but we couldn't say it could do so 10% better or whatever, most likely. We see so far, going back to the locomotor superiority hypothesis, that there are hints of some superior abilities of early dinosaurs to be able to run quickly and jump high. That's just hints. We are not hanging our hat on that idea so far. We need to do more simulations of more animals. Nonetheless, there are good hints in our simulations, like with that coelophysis simulation, that the longer lower limbs of early ornithodira, which is basically dinosaurs and their closest relatives, those long lower limbs are consistent with greater athleticism. However, also, it's not something we asked about initially, but it's something we found about by examining our simulations in more detail, that the tails are really, really important to these animals, especially in things like a bipedal animal such as coelophysis, which we don't really have a good representative of around the world today. There are lizards that can run bipedally for short stretches. There are birds, but they don't have these long tails. So this tells us something really important that we are learning uniquely from a fossil, that these tails can be used dynamically rather than just sitting there as wasted masses or counterbalances or whatever. They can be used to make movements more effective, like jumping higher and more stable and efficient walking and running. Now, like I said multiple times, this work is very much still underway. We've built lots and lots of models, 13 different representative species across the crocodile and bird lineages, including some of the ones I've shown here. Some of the work is published, some of the work is still yet to come out. So yeah, watch this space. These images show some of the weird diversity of animals here. Some on the crocodile lineage were bipedal, and that's something we still don't understand, is what were they like compared to the earliest bipedal dinosaurs. They evolved this ability completely separately. Whereas other ones, we're not even sure if they were bipedal or quadrupedal, or in some cases, we are pretty sure they were quadrupedal. Nonetheless, we would like to know how they moved and how that movement compared with the movements of other animals that they lived along with, and thereby ultimately be able to better address this locomotor superiority hypothesis and understand how locomotion evolved across this really massively diverse group called the archosaurs. So that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hutchinson. Thank you. That was a really, really fascinating talk, and there's been lots of very interesting questions. I think it's a really good contrast to what we've had this morning. So we have a few minutes, so perhaps there's a few questions I can come back to you, kind of paraphrasing some of the questions we've had as we've gone through. So I think one interesting thing about what you're showing is, again, maybe starting from what you showed at the beginning, is why do different animals converge to different body sizes in the same ecosystem? So why do we see these patterns?
For body size.
Yeah.
Oh boy, that's a very hard question to answer. Body size is such a fundamental parameter of animals. It affects almost every aspect of animal biology. So it's very hard pointing to one thing and saying
Yeah.
that's why these animals were converging to similar body sizes. We do know for like very large body size, it has like an elephants and the giant sauropod dinosaurs. It has a huge benefit in terms of monopolizing resources, being
Yep.
very efficient in moving long distances, so migrating and so forth for land animals. Being big is very good, and
Yep.
also defending from predators. Being big is in
Mm.
itself a defense. But it is a bad strategy in evolutionary terms for any sort of rapid environmental change. So the animals that tend to go extinct first in a mass extinction are the big animals
Yeah.
because they're less able to evolve quickly. Smaller animals,
Mhm.
because of short generation times,
Yep.
large population sizes, so on and so forth,
Mhm.
they can evolve rapidly and therefore um, potentially survive mass extinctions more easily than bigger animals.
Really interesting. I was also wondering, in the in the simulations you're doing in the modeling, do you make any assumptions about the brain or the cognitive capabilities
Mm.
of the animal? How does, because you focus on the passivity, the dynamics, the muscle models, but is there anything about the brain, the central nervous system?
No, these are very stupid simulations, very, very stupid, embarrassingly so. They're just feed forward simulations, so
Mhm.
they just seek to run as quickly as they can
Yep.
blindly. There's no nervous system.
Yep.
There's no, yeah, no sensor or motor control. We'd love to have feedback, and that
Hmm.
is certainly a frontier that I'd like to move into more and more because we know it'll be helpful to have that kind
Yep.
of information. Yeah, so that's the short answer. Um, they're dumb.
And actually, picking up a question for a couple of people about this kind of translating these simulations you're doing to robot models.
Mm.
A, do you
Mhm.
think there is value in this? And also, what do you think would be most, if there is, what are the most useful things that you could explore in that in a way that you could not do in simulation? Is it more the environment? Is it more what is interesting to explore there that which you might
So I
share with
guess
us?
there are two questions. What can we learn about the biology from the robotics
Yep,
application, and what can we learn about or from the biology that we can apply to robotics?
yep,
I think the second question is maybe easier. That, for example, I talked about the tail being really
yep.
helpful as a dynamic jumping and running structure. I mean, maybe it's obvious to roboticists, but at least there's a specific example of here's where this organ can be used and how it can be used.
So just jumping on
So
that, do you think, for example, so the humanoids, there's an explosion of humanoid robots. Do you think there is a reason, and obviously as humans we don't have tails, but do you think actually having humanoids with tails on would be a meaningful thing to explore? Or
I think it'd be very cool, but there are certainly downsides because then if you're dedicating more percentage of your total body mass to a tail, then you have less percentage of your body mass for other things like arms or
Yeah,
something else. Something else
yeah,
has
yeah,
to go.
yeah.
Arms can be used in many ways, like the tail, as
Like you were saying.
stabilizing organs and so forth. So, um, yeah, I think there could be certainly uses for tails in robotics and other applications, but in humanoid robots, unless you really want that for a certain application, I
Stabilization.
don't know why. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I still want to see it. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Um, the last thing I was just to wrap up, and I think there's really many interesting questions. So I'm sorry we don't have time to get to these in total. Is just the role of the environment a little bit in all your simulations. Do you
Mhm.
think the environment in which these animals evolved and they were kind of living has some effect on this? And obviously in simulation it's very hard to capture this, but where do you see the role of the environment in the development and evolution?
A problem is the animals we're looking at are globally distributed
Mm.
across vastly varying environments. The environments in the Triassic maybe weren't as varied as they are. Well, they weren't as varied as they are today. There's no Arctic or Antarctic poles, very cold areas. There were large deserts and so forth. It's just a hard it's easy to phrase questions like how would these animals move across what rough terrain? What would that do to their abilities, and which ones would be better able to cross rough terrain, more stable
Yep.
or robust or whatever? But applying that back to the actual environments they had would be tricky,
Yep.
but potentially informative. It is something I would like to look at least in terms of understanding the trade-offs. Biomechanics is always about trade-offs. So if you're good at running really quickly, it might help you really well on nice level, homogeneous ground. But as soon as you get onto very complex terrain, that might begin to fall apart, and having a different kind of morphology might be more advantageous in that kind of situation.
Thank you. Then last question. In fact, just one coming back to low-level detail about your the muscle models. So I think you mentioned the simple muscle and then also the hill model, and in the end you had very effective simulations with just the simple muscle. So do you think that it points to that it's reasonable to kind of remove the complexity of these hill model, or do you think it's more of a case-by-case basis?
I think it depends on the question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still nervous about that particular model
Mm.
because it is so assumption laden, and it is a drastic oversimplification of the muscle. And in many questions, you do want to know about the specific architecture of different muscles. So by using the simple muscle model, we had to treat all muscles as basically the same,
Mm-hmm.
built the same force capacity, so forth. And that is definitely not true of real muscles. Like that giant caudifemoralis muscle, longest muscle that ran from the tail to the thigh, that's a
Yep.
couple percent of body mass right there.
Yeah.
It's a huge percentage of the muscle mass of the limb. So if treating that as equal to the mass of any other muscle is wrong. So we can't learn about how that muscle worked without having a like a hill type model or something like that really individualizes the treatment of muscles. So yeah, there are trade-offs there in the assumptions and benefits.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you again so much, Professor Hutchinson. That was really interesting. And as you can see, many questions touching on this from robotics, lots of viewpoints. So thank you so
Right.
much. Really interesting. And again, I think for me, I posted the link to your website, which is really interesting in the chat. So please do have a look. And yeah, please post any other further questions. And hopefully, if you have time, Professor Hutchinson, we can come back to you again in the Q&A later on.
Yeah, I'll be sticking around.